Woodstock as authentic rock and roll. Welcome to Media Rants. I'm Tony Palmieri. You know, we are in August of 2019, and that means it is the 50th anniversary of the famous Woodstock concert. 3 days of peace and music, probably a little bit of sex and drugs thrown there also. Breakout performances by The Who, by Santana, Jimi Hendrix, and many others. You know, for me, Woodstock 1969 is a classic example of what I call authentic rock and roll. Most of what we know as rock and roll in this country I call corporate product, but Woodstock was the real deal. It was the authentic. Now, what does that mean? I define authentic rock and roll as an anarchic, Africa-inspired, anti-establishment art form perpetually co-opted by the forces of tradition. Now, I teach a class called The Rhetoric of Rock and Roll, and usually at that point someone raises their hand and says, is that definition going to be on the test? No, it won't be on the test, but let me explain all three parts of it. By anarchic, I mean that rock and roll, authentic rock and roll, breaks down hierarchies. The minimum wage worker, the child of the Fortune 500 executive are all on the same dance floor. You know, in a very real sense, rock and roll makes all of us part of the 99%. It is truly anarchic. By Africa-inspired, I mean that the rhythm and beats of rock and roll come from Africa. Ray Manzarek, who was the great keyboard player for The Doors, once said that without the black man, you don't have jazz and you don't have rock and roll. That Africa inspiration is actually what led to the racist backlash against rock and roll in the 1950s. By anti-establishment, I mean that authentic rock and roll really is against any kind of conformity to mainstream establishment norms. Anti-establishment means that rock and roll urges us all to find ourselves, to be who we want to be, and think as we want to think. Now, for more than 60 years, what I call the forces of tradition have pushed back against authentic rock and roll. They've tried to make it into some kind of non-threatening, family-friendly kind of Disney product, something that makes profits for record companies and radio stations. But Woodstock 1969 is a rare example of a time when all those forces of authentic rock and roll, the anarchy, the Africa inspiration, the anti-establishment, all converged in one 3-day festival. I think the epitome of rock and roll as I'm talking about it at the Woodstock concert would be Santana's performance of Soul Sacrifice. The energy, the connection with the crowd was completely in tune, pardon the pun, with what I've called authentic rock and roll. And appropriately enough, Santana's most recent album is called Africa Speaks. The entire album is done with the African singer Wika. It's really outstanding. You should check it out on your favorite streaming site. And so, for a more in-depth look at Woodstock and rock and roll as I've described it, go to my blog, Tony Palmieri's Media Rants. Look for Woodstock as authentic rock and roll. You can find hyperlinks. You can find videos to some of the themes I've raised today. So happy birthday, Woodstock, and until next time, I'm Tony Palmieri, and this is Media Rants.